If you've been following the channel for a while, you may remember we did a video once talking about the best bass for guitars. Now, in that situation, we talked about the short scale bass. Today we want to elaborate a little bit more on short scales and talk about why they may not be the best bass just for guitar players, but for anybody. Stick around. Hello everybody, this is Carlos with Alamo Music Center here in beautiful downtown San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to our channel, like our videos, sign up for notifications because we have so much content and we don't want you to miss any of it. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about short scale. Now, when we're talking about short scale bass and short scale in general, what do we mean by that? Well, simply put, we're just talking about the distance between the nut and the bridge, how long of a gap there's going to be between there. Now for the normal bass, or at least standard long scale, standard scale, whatever you may hear be called, that's typically going to be around the 34-inch range. Now the reason for that stems back to 1951, just about, when Fender introduced the precision bass. When the P-bass was introduced as being one of the first modern electric bass guitars, in that it created kind of a standard for that 34-inch. Now the short scale though is not any kind of variation or anything new. Even in those very early days of Fender's bass, and remember when you create something new, the first thing that's going to happen is other people are going to create copies. Even back in those early days of the early 50s, Fender's direct competitors like Gibson, Hofner, a whole slew of smaller other companies, even Japanese markets, were already producing short scale basses, with some range going up to as low as 31 inches just about. So probably one of the most famous in this example is actually going to be the Hofner V500-1 violin bass, or just in general the Hofner violin bass. It was February 6th, I want to say, 1964, the Ed Sullivan Show. The Beatles appear when Sir Paul McCartney performed one of the most iconic performances in rock and roll history, utilizing the Hofner violin bass, immediately launching it into an iconic status. So with that being said, we're talking about how it did have its boom. And in the 60s, trust me, it wasn't just Paul McCartney. There was a whole lot of artists that were utilizing some form of a short scale, whether it be a Gibson, a Hofner, with some of these Japanese variants. So with that boom happening in the 60s, why is it that in the modern times and since then, there's been a slight change in the perception of the short scale bass? Now, it's no secret that to more casual players, or maybe somebody that's not too familiar with short scale altogether, there is a perception that these basses are designed either for children or maybe for learning purposes only, or in that spectrum. As to why that's the case, really there is no answer that we can directly define, and really, to be honest, there's a lot of theory surrounding why short scale specifically could have been relegated to that kind of situation. Some of them stemming from carbon copies that were very bad quality. We're talking about short scale while there's a lot of benefits, the other benefit that comes to it is less material. It's a lot easier to create short scale basses compared to a full scale bass when you're not really focusing on the quality directly as much as producing them in a quantity spectrum. So the market did get saturated with a lot of lower quality short scales. But again, there was a lot of situation where that happened with long scale basses, and even guitars as we know now have that situation, still haven't created any kind of issue. There's other theories as well that the perception and the public image changed. As we go into the 70s, hard rock started happening. We have bass. As we go into the 80s and the 90s, we start seeing the 5-string get more prevalent. Maybe these things could have contributed. Probably one of the bigger theories, which I can kind of see as the most one, is just going to be marketing. Which was that at the time there was no secret that a lot of marketing agencies and people started marketing this short scale bass to children and marketing them for learning purposes. Your child learning, typically, if you're lucky, you have one, but for the most part, you're not going to have a child prodigy. You're going to have a child that wants to learn. So in marketing, that kind of became easy. Now, again, the question arises, why did the short scale become that situation versus the long scale? Again, no real answer. My kind of opinion on that probably is that the precision bass was the first electric modern bass. It was designed at that 34-inch radius, or that around that longer range. That originality definitely would have created a perception, in my opinion as well, that anything differentiating from that would have been a carbon copy or not the original. And also maybe at the time of the way marketing would have happened in the 70s or 80s, you also have to factor in a bigger bass could relate to maybe having somebody that's grown up versus a smaller bass being somebody that's smaller. Again, all those things could have relegated to something that pushed the perception and helped with fueling it to change from just being an option to kind of having a niche option. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and hear out, this short scale. For right now, what we're working with is going to be a Gretsch, but we also do have an Ibanez. Now the Ibanez is considered, at least by their branding, a micro, but for all intents and purposes, it is still just short scale bass. Pretty much we're just talking about anything, at least for the purposes of this video, anything that's under that normal long scale, standard scale, whichever you may hear, that 34-inch that we are familiar with. So let's go ahead and do that. Now what you're going to hear, just to get an idea, is you're going to hear the DI. The reason why is because we do have an amp here that I have for reference, just so I can hear it better than just, but we do have it with the DI, so that way when you hear it at home, it is going to be a lot more of the natural tone that you're going to be getting directly from the bass. Now the reason why that's important is because this will give you an idea of what's going to be going into your amp. Now remember, a loud amp is always the case, so it's not going to worry about any volume or anything like that. The amp, just turn it up louder if you have a loud enough amp. But really what you can also get an idea of is the recording aspect. A lot of the times when recording, we may just do a DI plugin, so you can get an idea of what tones you're going to be having inside of your DAW, your interface, and really just get the true sonic tone that this will give you without having any kind of idea or perception of a small amp, small guitar, none of that stuff. Just the raw, natural sound. So stick around, and then we'll talk a little bit more afterwards about why the short scale is different from a long scale, not just from the size wise, but even from a physics standpoint. Stick around. So what you heard was the DI straight bass tone coming from the Ibanez, coming from the Gretsch. And if you have the opportunity, if you didn't do so, maybe to go back and listen to it with either headphones or studio monitors if you have that option, just so you can get a better idea of the representation of what you get. Now, for a lot of you that are in the know, the folks that understand short scale bass, you probably already knew what to expect from what you heard whenever I played it. But for those of you that are either new to the channel or maybe new to the idea of short scale basses or bass, maybe bass in general, you may have been pleasantly surprised to find out that the tone coming from these two are surprisingly richer, warm, arguably maybe a kind of a darker presence to them. And it can be kind of interesting to think that at first when you're not familiar with why, as to how something that's smaller in scale would suddenly produce these kind of darker, richer melodies. Well, let's go over that a little bit. Now, a lot of you cats watching this may already know why that's the case, but for those of you that aren't too familiar with all of the technical aspects of bass and notes and all that good stuff, this is going to require just a little bit of, I guess, like music theory knowledge. So bear with me as I'll explain it with you. So anytime you hit a note of any kind, this is not just bass, we're talking any instrument in general. Anytime you hit a note, there is going to be an overtone that is going to be produced as well. These overtones we can refer to as harmonics. When I hit this right here, this, for example, 5th fret, 4th string, we're producing the tone that makes, under a standard tuning, EADG, the note A. Now, with that A that is being produced, as I mentioned, there is overtones, harmonics that are also being produced in conjunction with that. These harmonics can vary in volume, and how they vary in that volume and how they play with that original root note is going to be the essence of what we call the color, the timbre, the maybe even tone of the instrument we're playing with. Now, you actually I will understand before we continue that just kind of explaining this on surface can be kind of confusing if you're new to these concepts. But if you've ever tuned by ear, you've actually already been exposed to this. It's no surprise that whenever you play 5th fret, 4th string, open fret, 3rd string, that yes, you'll produce the same A, but it's not going to necessarily, for lack of a better phrase, feel the same, even if it does sound the same. The 5th fret on the 4th string, whether it's being played physically here, being played through an amplifier, it will normally always produce a much more, we can say, warmer, darker, richer tone than hitting the open string on the 3rd. Have you ever asked yourself why that's the case? Well, it relates back to these overtones and harmonics, but it also relates back to that scale length, as we mentioned when it comes to the short scale. When you place your finger down on the 5th fret, and then you strum the note, at the end of the day, all that's happening to produce that note is that there is a vibration on that string. A vibration produces a sound. That sound at the right pitch gives us a note. In essence, that's how it works. When we place our finger on the 5th fret to produce the vibration needed to make an A note, this right here is going to be producing those vibrations only between the scale of this 5th fret and this nut. So to put it in perspective without dropping this bass, we're looking at a distance of about this much. It takes this much space to produce that note, the A. Now when we do the same thing on the open string, right below it, 3rd, to produce that same exact note, now we're creating that note through the point of the bridge itself and vice versa, the nut itself and the bridge. So in essence, we have this length right here. So in essence, we have this length right here to create an A versus this length right here to create that same exact A. That change in size is going to also impact how those overtones are going to play with the note, how loud they are, how they interact, and in essence, change that timbre, that tone, give us that richer, darker, warmer versus that brighter tone. In essence, while that happens at any juncture when we're playing on the frets, in essence, that's the same thing that's happening with a short scale versus a long scale. When we're dropping it down from 34 to 31 to 33 to 32, whatever it takes, we are changing the length of string, in essence, that is needed to produce the same notes. And by doing so, we're also affecting those overtones, those harmonics, changing how they play with the sound and the note. Thus, it's no surprise that in general, again, we're talking about a $200 to $300 short scale versus like a $5,000 long scale. It's not a fair comparison. But when we're talking about one of the direct contemporary, maybe a Gretsch long scale versus a Gretsch short scale, or something within that same price range, you're likely to find that that is going to be true across the board. That typically a short scale is going to have a much more, what we would call darker, warmer and kind of richer tone than its long scale contemporaries. So why would we want to go to the short scale in general? As mentioned, there is a lot of reasons why, and as to whether this stigma exists about for children or for smaller people or maybe even for just learning, it is, to me at least, a little confusing as to where that actually comes from in the long run, or why even to this day we still perpetuate it in some kind of fashion. Be honest, at the end of the day, the issues you're going to have with this Gretsch, and we're going to actually, if depending on when this video is out, it probably is already out or not, we're going to discuss this in detail. But the issues you're going to get with this Gretsch is not going to be anything related to the short scale, long scale. It's going to be the same issues you're going to get with any bass guitar. In general, for the most part, we like to think, the more expensive the instrument, the higher quality of material being used, the higher quality of the material the bass or the instrument is. Ultimately, if you're buying a $200 short scale versus a $1,000 short scale, things of that nature, you're going to get a change in quality. That's not exclusive to short scale. That's just across the board. Any instrument you're going to get, whether we're talking about drums, clarinet, stringed instruments, whatever, you're usually going to find that to be the case. We would hope. That's not always so. We all have had some bad experiences, even from some out-of-the-box high-end companies. But the point is, we still expect that to be the case. So that's universal. Ultimately, in my opinion, I'm going to call it bias, because I really personally love short scale bass guitars, and I really don't have anything that I can really negatively say about them in the grand scheme. Is there any cons, really? Maybe superficial, arbitrary ones. Yes, there is even to this day a stigma that they're for children, or that they're for learning, or that they're for smaller people. If you're a bigger individual and you have bigger hands and you're used to playing bass on the normal scale, your hands will have to adjust. But again, even at that, that's like saying big people or tall people can't play guitar. So that argument doesn't really work either. I mean, ultimately, what we're going to get here is going to be mostly related to tone and preference of anything else. Those darker, those deeper, those richer tones, they're great, but not everybody's chasing them. Not everybody wants them. Some people don't want the darker, richer. They want the brighter. They want it to be more springier. They want it to be more on the higher end. Maybe you may not find that on a short scale. So that's an understandable situation, and I can say an understandable con. If you are chasing a particular tone that the shorter scale richness will never give you by the mere physics or whatever you want to call it, that's a fair con why you might want to stay in long scale. But let's talk about the short scale. Yes, ultimately, while they're not designed for that, it is as Bob Ross would say, a happy accident that yes, a smaller scale is going to benefit folks like me that are a little bit smaller, children, people that maybe want to learn. But it doesn't just help them. We're talking about folks that are bigger, that have bigger hands. What is this smaller scale going to give you? Well, it's going to give you the opportunity to play chords and to do reaches that you never would have otherwise been able to do on a regular scale, or at the very least do them comfortably, much more comfortable. Shorter scale means what else? Faster neck. When it takes as much effort as going from the 5th fret pretty much of a regular bass down to here, compared to where a normal fret would be over on this end by the head, we're going to naturally get a situation where you can reach a lot more solos and reach a lot more of the neck melodically faster and easier. And as well as that kind of closing in on the gap space will also mean that you, as I mentioned, can reach across more easier. So with those creation and techniques, we're not even just talking about techniques that we can play in general. We also want to factor in something else. The fact that smaller typically, and this is a little bit on the heavier side compared to that Geo, but in general, smaller normally means lighter. And while it's heavier than the Geo, I can tell you this definitely isn't as heavy as a regular bass. So what does that mean that it's smaller and weighs less? Well, it means a couple of important things. Number one, if you are a hobbyist at this point, maybe it may not impact you, but if you're a professional musician, a touring musician, a gigging musician, lighter bass means that you're going to have less wear and strain on your body as you perform live. And another thing that maybe isn't taken into account is the strain on your playing hand. when you maybe are more of a progressive or jazz or fusion or doing something where you are able to go all across the board of the fretboard, right? The fact that you don't have to move your hand as long and as far and as wide as a long scale or standard scale would give you is going to provide you a lot more added benefit to your arm not wearing out as quickly. Now, when it comes to the tone itself, many professional bass players know that these are possibly the bass guitar's best kept secret. The fact that they produce such a rich tone normally is going to provide you such an amazing thing in the studio when you're recording as a studio musician. And in that situation, in that spectrum, remember that when people are listening back to the recording, they're never going to know what you played with, really, at the first listen. But they will immediately know whether it sounds good or not. And these, and myself personally would like to start using them more too. These definitely are amazing in the studio as well too. Very versatile for having both a practical usage live as well as also in the studio where we can have it on a more professional if you're looking at that spectrum too. But one more quick note when we're talking about the practical and sense of live. Smaller scale also means lighter footprint. If, let's say we don't have the fortune to be Rush or Judas Priest where we have a 15-man crew just to carry one guitar. This is going to be you in your van, in your car. If you're lucky with some friends, depending on how old you are or how dedicated you are, right? This is you guys in a van. Remember, this doesn't mean just a smaller size bass. It also means a smaller size case. Now, I fortunately now myself have bought a new car which has a very substantial trunk space. But beforehand, I did not have I had more of a compact car. And my regular bass of choice is a Stingray. This in its hard shell case would not fit in the trunk in general. And in the back seat required me to have to do one of those kind of closes to finally get it to close, as long as I angled it correctly. That probably a problem with the compact car that I had, yes, but still it's a valid point that this in a regular case probably would have fit in the trunk. That retail space you're not taking up means that you have less space where you can carry more things that are essential. So if you're carrying an amp, if you're carrying a pedal board, if you're carrying a guitar, there may not be as much wear and tear on your items because you're not going to necessarily have to have them smushed up against each other, thrown up against each other, rubbed up against each other. They have more flexibility to breathe. And additionally, you don't have to necessarily overthink what has to be done. And again, at the end of the day, when you're touring, let's say you're going on a tour where you're playing every day, you have to take this out of your car, take it to the venue, play it, take it off stage, take it back. This repeated wear and tear with a lighter footprint, even easier. So ultimately, I know that we did a video talking about the best bass for guitarists, but I really would like to make an amendment on that and say that short scale is really maybe one of the best basses for any bassist or anybody in general. Yes, you get the benefit from a guitar player standpoint that feels like a guitar. Like right now, I feel like I'm holding a guitar more than a bass, yeah. But more than that, the smaller scale can, yes, accommodate children, smaller people. But breaking away from just that stigma that that's what it's meant for, smaller scale means it's going to give us a richer, warmer tone. Smaller scale means that we're going to have less wear and tear on the actual playing. Smaller scale means we're going to open up the spectrum of what we can think and what we can play. So ultimately, whether you're looking for a short scale or not, or whether you want to try it or not, ultimately, that's up to you. I know there's probably a lot of questions about short scale as well that you may have on your own particular, as in a personal, that maybe this video can't cover. So maybe they need a little bit more bespoke answer. Remember, if you're in the San Antonio area, you can always come to Alamo Music Center. And if you're not, you can go to alamomusic.com where we have a chat service where we'll be more than happy to help you with any questions you have about your journey specifically in getting a short scale. We're not going to go over what short scale to get or anything of that nature because there's a lot of great options. Even the one I'm holding right now, while it's an amazing Gretsch, it's by far, even the Micro we played, those are by far your only options. And I believe we've actually already reviewed a short scale bass on the acoustic spectrum as well too. So there is a lot of options. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to help you on any point of your musical journey to get you into the next instrument you're looking for. So what about you? Do you have a short scale? Have you played a short scale? You've been thinking about getting one? We'd love to hear from you. Did you have a good experience with a short scale? Did you have a bad experience? Leave a comment below letting us know what you've experienced with your short scale, if you've had one, or if you're thinking about getting one. We always love to hear from you and know where you're at in your journey. And again, there may be a stigma currently still that's slowly getting away from it. I'll admit we are. That says that these are more of introductory or starter guitar. But I think as we slowly move away from that stigma and slowly break away from that perception, not just bass players, but musicians around the world are going to find this secret weapon to become just the standard of something that's a second option. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you guys got a lot more information about the short scale. Again, we'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for your support. This is Carlos with Alamo Music Center. You have a great rest of your day.